He was just a fisherman building a life in Maryland when he was accused of a 9-year-old's murder. Despite absolutely no physical evidence tying him to the crime scene, he was convicted not once, but twice. But years later, his call for DNA testing made him pretty famous. This is a story of Kirk Bloodsworth, the innocent man who was put on death row thanks to some shoddy eyewitness accounts. Hi friends, I'm Katie, and this is Katie Does Crime. Thank you for joining me for the first time if you're new here, and hello to the usual rapscallions and reprobates. Please consider subscribing or joining me on Patreon if you'd like to hear more true crime stories. There's even a free tier of Patreon, in case you didn't know, where I'm going to be posting more content. Today's case was actually recommended to me by one of my Patreon patrons, who said she was a public defender and was in the courtroom for one of Kirk's hearings. And you know I can't resist a case where the real killer eventually gets his day in the sun, or the shade, however that metaphor works. Thank you to M Center and everyone who sends me case recommendations. Kirk Noble Bloodsworth was born on Halloween 1960 and was a young man living in Maryland in 1984. He had done a tour of duty as a Marine and was a champion discus thrower in the service. Now he was an out-of-work fisherman who sometimes coached high school sports, just a regular guy. So it came as a surprise when he was suddenly accused of murder one day in July. On July 25, 1984, 9-year-old Dawn Venice Hamilton was found dead in the woods behind her family's townhouse in Fontana Village in Rosedale. That day, 2 boys were fishing in a pond and had caught a turtle. A man approached and started talking to them about the turtle until the little girl came and asked if anyone had seen her friends. The man said, "No, but I'll help you find them." The boys decided not to go along, which may have either saved their lives or doomed little Dawn's. I wonder what would have happened if there had been witnesses. Dawn, a soon-to-be 4th grader, had left her home at around 11 a.m., and when her friends came home without her, the police came looking for her. When officers questioned the boys by the pond, they were able to describe the man as white, young, blonde, curly-haired, mustachioed, and wearing tan shorts and a striped Ocean Pacific t-shirt. He was probably late 20s or early 30s and was about 6 feet tall. One boy told his mom that the man was a stranger to him, but seemed nice. At 2:30 p.m. that same day, Dawn's body was found. The first clue was her shorts and underwear hanging from a tree in the woods. She was off the path, face down in thick brush. She was only wearing her yellow blouse, white socks, and blue sneakers. Her face had been hit with something blunt. She had been strangled when someone stood on her neck, and she had been assaulted. The woods had always seemed dangerous to the local parents, and a woman had been killed in the complex the prior year, so a playground had been built to keep the kids closer to home. It didn't work for Dawn. On August 9th, the Baltimore Sun announced that Kirk Bloodsworth had been arrested for her murder. An anonymous woman had called the police and said the sketch looked just like Kirk, who worked at the Harbor to Harbor wicker furniture store in Rosedale. More than 500 such calls were made to police about this man or that man, but Kirk also fit the psychological profile the FBI had created for the murderer. He lived 2 miles from Dawn and was late to his temporary furniture store job the day after she disappeared. He called in sick the next week and then never returned to work. In fact, he hitchhiked to a relative's house, completely leaving the area without even telling his wife. 3 people who lived in Dawn's complex agreed that the man they saw on the day of her murder looked like Kirk. So he was their number 1 suspect. Kirk's family thought it was ridiculous to accuse him of murder, but the family always thinks that. He was charged with first-degree murder and denied bail. He faced the death penalty. At trial in March 1985, it was revealed that Dawn had been abused with an 8-inch stick and hit repeatedly with a chunk of concrete. The state said that Kirk had told police Dawn was killed with a rock before the murder weapon was made public. But the thing is, during this interview, they placed a rock and a pair of underwear in front of Kirk as a questioning technique, so they suggested the rock before he ever did. And also, I would argue that a chunk of concrete, which Dawn was killed with, is not a rock. Kirk's lawyers said that a hair and a fingerprint found at the scene didn't belong to him. There was only circumstantial evidence, and none of it pointed to Kirk. There was a bruise on Dawn's body that looked similar to the sole of a pair of shoes found in Kirk's home, but an FBI expert said hundreds of thousands of shoes had that same design. Oh, and also, that shoe print was 2.5 sizes smaller than Kirk's size. In a very O.J. Simpson-like move, a local shoe salesman tried shoes on Kirk in the same size as the bruise on Don and said they were too small for him. The Baltimore Sun wrote that the 5 prosecution witnesses had been somewhat inconsistent in their testimony that Kirk was at the crime scene that day. One woman originally told police that she hadn't gotten a good look at the man Don was with that day, but now testified that she definitely saw Kirk speaking with Don. On the other hand, 5 defense witnesses placed Kirk at home at the time of the murder, and 2 other witnesses said that when Kirk wasn't at home that day, he was with them, going to buy weed, and their testimony had held up just fine under tough cross-examination. 2 witnesses said Kirk had told them he'd done a terrible thing, and in the mind of the prosecutors, that terrible thing was obviously the murder. But Kirk's mother-in-law said that she knew what this thing was, and it was something that didn't shock her. In fact, when he told her, she laughed about it. She wasn't allowed to say what it was in court, though. Kirk testified on his own behalf that he had never been near Don's home and that he didn't simply not return to work after the murder, he actually quit. He said the terrible thing he did was not take his wife out for a taco salad he'd promised her the night before he left. And the reason he left was to go find new work to pay off their mounting debt. He said he left without telling her because they weren't getting along and he felt she didn't want him there. So that more or less explained all of the prosecution's accusations away. And I mean, the description of the man seen with Don didn't even match Kirk. You can say that kids could get height or age wrong, but they said the man had blonde hair, and Kirk's hair was very red. And yet, on March 8, 1986, the jury deliberated for under 3 hours, and Kirk Bloodsworth was convicted. I guess the jury didn't buy the taco salad defense. On March 18th, a judge denied a motion for a new trial for Kirk. A detective had said that there was another man who was a very good suspect, but the report on that suspect had been inadmissible at trial. Kirk's lawyer argued that this kept Kirk from getting a fair trial. But the judge ruled that the existence of this other suspect didn't mean Kirk was innocent. He said there was enough evidence against Kirk for him to have been convicted. By that, he meant the handful of eyewitnesses who are notoriously bad at remembering things, and the boys from the pond who couldn't pick out Kirk in court. On March 22nd, Kirk was sentenced to death and 2 consecutive life terms. The judge noted that Kirk had no criminal record, no history of violent nor deviant behavior, but he said the horrors visited upon Don were beyond description. Kirk's father said, "I didn't much expect anything less. The whole damn thing, in plain English, is shocking. I can feel, I really do, for the parents of that child, but to possibly be taking another innocent life, this is 2 crimes." One thing I love is that the prosecutor later said in an interview that Kirk's external appearance and reputation for nonviolence belied the suggestion that he could be a vicious killer. Like, he didn't look like a killer, and he didn't act like a killer, but he was definitely a vicious killer. Although another possibility might be that he was not actually a killer. But I digress. Kirk did have a win a few months later. On July 29, 1986, the Maryland Court of Appeals ruled that actually, Kirk's rights had been violated when his lawyer wasn't allowed to use the police report that implicated another suspect. The judges on the panel agreed that the state had presented enough evidence to convict Kirk, which I just find amazing, but they said he should get a new trial based on that other suspicious man. After 16 months, Kirk was taken off death row. In April 1987, Kirk's lawyers asked to have the charges against him completely dismissed, because listen to this. One of the witnesses who picked out Kirk in a police lineup in 1984 had seen his arrest on the news days before. So he gets arrested, she sees his face on the news, and then she points him out in a lineup. Knowing that she was a witness and would be participating in a lineup, the police had told her not to watch the news, but she said she had to because she was nosy and curious. And obviously Kirk's attorneys were never told this. Amazing. The judge argued other people also identified Kirk, though. One of these people, it should be noted, was paid $200 in reward money for identifying Kirk in a lineup. Yet the judge denied the motion for dismissal. However, a few days later, a judge did dismiss the assault charge against Kirk. He said there was enough evidence for a new murder trial, though. At the new trial, the mysterious second suspect was put in the hot seat. He had been there to help with the search for Don and had seemed suspicious enough that he was taken in for questioning. When searching his car, police found a pair of little girl's underwear. Not Don's, but someone's. He said that he had found them and was going to give them to his daughter. Quite the present, someone else's underwear. But this man looked nothing like the man witnesses had described, including the clothes he'd been wearing when he helped with the search for Don. Kirk's attorneys said to the jury, "Are you going to convict this man of first-degree murder on this nonsense, this unmitigated garbage?" And they did. They convicted Kirk again. One juror said he tends to believe kids, even though, of course, at least one of the kids had failed to identify Kirk in the first trial. This time, the kid was suddenly absolutely sure Kirk was the killer. A third possible suspect was brought up this time just before the trial, one who was never put in a police lineup and was never mentioned to the defense before the first trial. But the jury hadn't been told about him because Kirk's lawyer didn't have time to verify anything. They couldn't just bring the idea to court without knowing what they were dealing with. So Kirk was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. The Evening Sun out of Baltimore said there were haunting questions left in the case. So Kirk appealed again in 1988, but the appeals court affirmed his sentence. But in May 1993, Kirk was in the news again. He had been working in the prison library and read about a new kind of DNA testing. The defense and prosecution had jointly asked that this testing be used on Dawn's underwear, her shirt, and the stick used to assault her. Back in the 80s, the less sophisticated techniques needed more of a sample than could be retrieved from the evidence. But the new testing had proven that Kirk's semen didn't match what was found at the crime scene. So he was free, right? Well, not quite. The Baltimore County prosecutors wanted to do their own testing. The assistant state's attorney insisted, though, that they were all working toward the same goal of knowing the truth. Luckily, the second test proved the same thing. Kirk didn't assault Dawn. So in June 1993, Kirk was released from prison. He was now 32 years old and finally exonerated after almost 9 years. He's called the first U.S. death row prisoner to be cleared by DNA. As he left prison, he waved to a group of supporters. He cried as he recalled how his mother had died 5 months before, never knowing that he would be freed. But he said she knew he wasn't a killer.
Even though this is a small victory for me to prove my innocence, the real killer is still out there. And all this won't be complete until the real one is behind bars.
At the time, Kirk was the 21st death row inmate to be released since 1980 because of new evidence, and he left in style in the back of a stretch limo with a beer and a cigar. He said there was nothing that could be done to compensate him for his time lost, but they ought to try. The state's attorney refused to call Kirk innocent, and Dawn's father said he didn't hold a grudge against Kirk. And I'm like, actually, he would be the one holding a grudge against you for how many times you talked about how happy you were that he was in jail. But of course, you can't blame a grieving father. Kirk applied for a pardon from the Maryland governor in October 1993, knowing he would need that before he could receive any compensation. He got to celebrate Christmas early when his pardon came in on December 23rd of that year. The governor said Kirk was convicted in error and wouldn't have even been tried today. Kirk had a new fiancée and a new puppy and a bottle of wine sent over by CBS Evening News anchor Connie Chung. He even had a new business with a friend, trapping muskrats, and was working on getting his crabbing license back. In June 1994, the state of Maryland agreed to pay him $300,000 for his time in prison, equivalent to about $631K today. He got an additional $420,000 in 2021. He said he would use part of the money to pay back his dad for supporting his legal defense and would use some of the rest to go to mortuary school. And I'm like, hey buddy, after they finally decide you're not a killer, perhaps you should not express an interest in dead bodies as your very next course of action. But of course, I kid. In 2003, Don Hamilton's true killer was found. Prosecutors in Maryland used the DNA that had exonerated Kirk and found a match in their offender database. His name was Kimberly Shea Ruffner, and he had been a known offender with a penchant for little girls at the time of Dawn's murder. He also lived near the woods where she was found. And not only that, he was now in prison, serving a 45-year sentence at the same prison where Kirk did time, for doing a similar thing to someone else just 3 weeks after Dawn's murder. Ruffner was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, which he can begin serving once his current 45 years are up. And even more frustrating, this man was neither the second nor third suspects who were known about at the time of Kirk's trials. He was completely off their radar. Had they arrested him when they arrested Kirk, maybe that other crime wouldn't have been committed. Maybe he would have been in custody then. With his obvious innocence and newfound fame, Kirk spoke out against the death penalty and became an advocate for the wrongfully convicted. He said that if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. He also recently served as the executive director of Witness to Innocence. It's an organization led by people who were on death row until they were exonerated, and they work to end the death penalty. He learned the art of silversmithing and has made silver rings for more than 200 fellow exonerees from that organization. I saw that he had a jewelry website and tried to find it so I could buy something from him, but it's now defunct. The Internet Archive helped me out with a screenshot, though, but enough about my stalking. Kirk helped 8 states abolish their death penalty laws through his advocacy, including his home state of Maryland. And there's even a federal law that has a grant program named after him. The Justice for All Act of 2004 has a Kirk Bloodsworth post-conviction DNA testing grant program that gives states money for post-conviction DNA testing. You know, the kind of testing that got him exonerated. It's so outrageous to me to think that Kirk was basically only ever a victim of the justice system because he worked at that furniture store. And it was just a temporary job. He was only there for 2 weeks. It's such bad luck. And because of it, he was called a monster. People said they were glad he was locked up. People applauded at his trial when he was found guilty. It turns out we're the real monsters. Kirk once said, "I am not here because the system worked. I am here because of a series of miracles. Not every person wrongfully convicted of a capital crime is as lucky." But I'm so happy for Kirk that he got a new life and has found purpose and importance in helping others. Fewer people will suffer because of his work. As always, please let me know what you think about this case in the comments. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm just a true crime fan like you are, and I really appreciate you taking a chance on me. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you like spending this time together. I would be so appreciative. Until next time, I'm Katie, and this has been Katie Does Crime.